I'm Ari Redbord. Welcome to TRM Talks. TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of anti-money laundering software and blockchain intelligence. Today, we have a very special guest, Laura Shin, the host of the Unchained podcast and someone covering the crypto space longer than absolutely anyone else out there. Laura, thank you so much for joining TRM Talks.
Thanks for having me. And just a little factual correction. There are journalists who've been covering it longer than I have.
I love it. Absolutely. I've been honored to be on Unchained a number of times. And I think this sort of opportunity to talk a little bit just about with so much going on in the crypto space, really not just this week, but this year and over the last, several months. I'm just really excited to kind of sit down with you and chat a little bit.
Yeah. Let's get to it.
Let's do it. So, honestly, I mentioned someone covering the space really longer than anyone. Well, you're really sort of the first, journalist to cover the space full time. And I think that journey is just so interesting. Would you talk a little bit about sort of your journey to the space and give us a sense of sort of how you made that transition?
Yeah. I had been covering personal finance, and I think I'd been covering it maybe about 4 years or something. And I was getting, just a little antsy to do something different. It's not very much like crypto in the sense that it doesn't change a lot. So I kind of was getting to the point where I felt like I'd really learned kind of most everything. And so my editors at Forbes threw me a bone because they knew that I was feeling the need to do something else. And they said, hey, we have this idea to do this Forbes FinTech 50 list. Do you want to head it up with another reporter? So she and I divided it into categories, and I took the category of digital currency and just became completely obsessed. I mean, for anybody who is in crypto, we all talk about that moment where you go down the rabbit hole. And what I just love about covering crypto is, you start with a question and then you kind of answer that question, but then what you learn there just leads to another question. And then, then what you learn there leads to yet another question. And then 8 years later, you're still, fascinated by this and can't stop trying to learn. Yes, exactly.
I love that. That's exactly rabbit hole defined for sure.
Yes. So at that time that I started this FinTech 50 list and I became obsessed with Bitcoin, I was a freelancer for Forbes, and at that time is when I started the podcast Unchained, which it'll have been 7 years next week, I think. Actually, I believe the launch episode was, I think, on June 14th, 2016. So yeah. So I then later started working there full time. But while I was there, the downloads became so big that it just became apparent that I should probably just leave and just do that. And so then I was doing the podcast and working on my book, and that came out last year. And so this past winter, we changed the website. So it's not just a podcast website anymore. And now there's like news and kind of learn type articles and videos. And we have a newsletter. So it's really branched out from just the podcast. And now it's like its own little media company.
Yeah, what's really extraordinary, and I was going to kind of just really jump into that, and that is Unchained is now a media company. It's really not just a podcast, which is pretty extraordinary. I was checking this. Literally this week was the 500th episode of Unchained, or last week was the 500th episode, which is pretty extraordinary. 25 million views and downloads. I mean, did you ever imagine when you left Forbes
where
we were headed? Yeah.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's so funny because when I first launched the podcast, I only did it every other week. And in fact, Forbes, so I always owned the podcast outright. However, I launched it as part of a series of podcasts that Forbes was launching in that summer of 2016. And after the first season, they just dropped it. And so I had to find my own sponsor so I could keep paying the engineer and all that. And I remember, in the fall of 2016, I was practically begging people to sponsor this show. Like it was so hard. Like I couldn't really find anybody. And then finally there was a company that had done a website for, one of the crypto companies, and they realized like, oh, there's this whole industry and there's all these new companies. Like maybe if we advertise here, we can, get people to use us for their website. And so they were the ones that were willing. And it's just fascinating because obviously now, I mean, everybody's sponsoring everything. There's like conferences all the time. There's, tons of podcast sponsorships going on. And I mean, it's just a completely different thing. But yeah, it's just fascinating how, like I said, when I started it, it really seemed like pushing a boulder up the hill because I loved podcasts. I loved crypto. So I really wanted to do it, but it didn't seem like people were that interested.
What was pretty extraordinary about crypto, and then really what you do is, it's crypto is everything, right? It's environmental, it's policy, it's technology. So you're really, and the guests run the gamut of those people. Everyone from, law enforcement, to, builders of the technology, across the different space. So, you become an expert on all these little things. It's so beyond financial services. What are of those 500? And I know this is a really tough question. It's like asking which your favorite child is. But what are the ones that really stand out to you that really you felt like had a really significant impact, or you think about all the time, sort of looking back on those all those 500?
Well, so actually, it's technically more like 650 because I used to have this other podcast called Unconfirmed on a separate feed.
Yes.
We just abandoned after a while. We just moved everything to the main feed. But I would say that probably there are certain episodes that stand out in my mind. One of them is one that we featured on that 500th episode that kind of picked different highlights from over the years. And frankly, it's one that is very newsworthy this week. It's an interview I did in 2018 with CZ, or Changpeng Zhao, the CEO of Binance. And I was asking him about regulation because, it was pretty obvious right from the get-go that he was doing this sort of like Uber/Travis Kalanick strategy of regulatory arbitrage. And, I questioned him on that. And hilariously, I still remember this because I thought it was so funny. He said, you're questioning me the way like because what I was getting at was that, the US regulators will take jurisdiction if they think that you are serving US customers. And he either was unaware of it, or he was pretending like he was unaware, or I don't know. But what he said to me was, he said, you're questioning me like, I'm a person who doesn't like hot weather, and you're telling me that I have to live in Florida. I thought it was so funny. And then the other thing was that he also, and I don't remember if this was the same interview or a different one because he came on the show later, but I said to him, hey, like BNB looks like a security. And Cass Piancy, who is, he does like crypto critics, what's it called? Crypto, Critics Corner podcast. They're all like critical of things going on in crypto, but he tweeted, and he just thought it was so funny that when I questioned CZ about that, CZ then proceeded to describe BNB exactly like according to the definition of a security. He was going on and on about how Binance was incentivized to make sure that it would succeed and to make sure, that it would, that the price would go up. And like, I mean, it was just like, I was saying, hey, it sounds like you're describing a security. And then he's like, no. And instead then proceeds to describe BNB exactly the way that, yes, the securities regulator would say, that sounds like a security. So, what's interesting to me also about that episode is, like I said, I did that interview in 2018 and here we are in 2023. And it's like literally the same exact issues that are in this complaint. I mean, granted, not the token stuff, but, about like serving US customers and, they think they're like not being in the US or they're even kind of being caught, like admitting that they know they're serving US customers and things like that. So, I mean, it wasn't like I was quote unquote warning him, but certainly by my line of questioning, he should have caught on that like, okay, yeah, if a journalist even and not a regulator is figuring out that like, this may not be the direction you want to go, like maybe they should have changed their tack earlier.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is I probably don't need to say this, but for our listeners, this is the week where SEC took action against both Binance and Coinbase for myriad sort of reasons, but really particularly for listing unregistered securities. And I think we'll see this play out in the courts and potentially Congress for really some time, but really kind of an extraordinary week in the space, sort of arguably the two most important centralized exchanges and the most important regulators now, sort of, head to head for sure.
Yeah. And by the way, Ari, this is so funny because I just feel this urge in me. I'm so curious to ask you for your thoughts because you used to work at DOJ.
This is the nature of things. No, absolutely. Turning the tables. I think it's a really interesting moment. I was at a conference or small group with Jeremy Allaire yesterday, and he actually had, I think, the best answer that I have heard yet for this question. And that is, look, we're now reached a point in the United States where all three branches of the U.S. federal government are dealing with this issue in pretty meaningful ways, right? You could look at the White House executive order and the response from every agency, right, that's now thinking about crypto. You are now seeing, activity on Capitol Hill maybe moving more quickly given some of these actions. A proposed bill last week that actually does create that sort of MiCA style framework for crypto, has definitions around sort of who is going to regulate securities or commodities. And then finally, and maybe most importantly right now, we're going to see this play out in the courts. You see sort of, Coinbase has, asked a court to order the SEC to provide some clarity around some of these issues. Obviously, you saw the SEC take action against Coinbase and Binance. So I think I thought it was just a fabulous answer because there's a world in which regulators say, hey, we don't want to touch this space. And we're actually seeing something completely the opposite here. We're seeing, regulators actually start to act. But hopefully that will result in more clarity from Capitol Hill.
But yeah, I mean, I can't help but wonder when you say we're starting to see regulators act. Do you think that their acts are
not starting
sensible?
Obviously, they've been acting for some time. Look, I think part of the issue is that having spent a long time in the DOJ and then a Treasury, I think regulators are always going to act. And I think what's so important is for Congress to provide the rules of the road.
Right. But do you think that these actions make sense? Do you think it makes sense for the SEC to sue Coinbase?
I think it's going to have to play out in the courts.
You're such a diplomat.
As are you. All right. Back to you, Laura. I knew you were going to do this. I will say that one of the most fun things, and I have been lucky enough, as I said, to be on 3 times, once to talk about Terra and the stable coins, one to talk about Sam Bankman-Fried's criminal case, and I think and wants to actually talk about Tornado Cash and what it actually meant, how blockchain analytics like TRM does screening for that. And I will say that they are always tough conversations, and you ask the tough right questions, but always fair. And I think that it's definitely sort of a skill that I've been trying to develop as a former prosecutor, but try to do this this podcast. So, but let me, we're on kind of the topic I wanted to be on, and that is policy. Obviously, sort of that's very much how we're thinking about the world, right? Like you have so many different aspects of the space that you think about, but really for me, it's sort of this very much focus on policy and even more on sort of the specific anti-money laundering, illicit finance space. How have you, over the course of your career, sort of covered, but also just thought about sort of the AML in crypto, right? We've gone from crypto's anonymous to everyone can trace every transaction. And the truth is probably somewhere in between. But where are you on that? And how are you thinking about illicit finance in crypto?
Well, so I have a few thoughts. One is that something that has been really surprising to me is to see how the mainstream views crypto as being kind of awash in criminal activity. And that actually isn't the reality. And so I feel like frequently when I'm interviewed by some of the mainstream outlets, I have to actually just bring the receipts. I have to say, okay, in the traditional financial world, there's probably about between 2 and 5% of all transactions that are illicit activity. And at least so far, what we've, seen in crypto, it's less than 1%. And, I have to say these are from these reputable sources, et cetera, et cetera. And still, I feel like that message hasn't really gotten out there that much. And it's not to say that criminals won't be attracted. Obviously, the very first real use case of Bitcoin was the Silk Road. So clearly, there I understand kind of like the reason why people have this conception, but the way crypto and Bitcoin were used back in 2012, 2013 is very different from how they're used today in 2023. And so just one thing I think about really is how do we kind of cut through all that noise and all of these misperceptions with the facts. And interestingly, even when I present the facts, people still somehow don't hear it. And so I just find that that is something excuse me, that bothers me as somebody who's interested in facts and feel like they can help us and are the best resource that we have for making decisions. So basically, I frankly, of course, think that these are really thorny questions around, how do you implement certain controls so that bad actors don't get access to these systems or these assets, but then how also do you respect things like privacy, which I think is a really important right that people have. And it's something that is protected in the Constitution. And it's something that I, as like a somewhat private person, really cherish. And yet at the same time, of course, I don't want criminals using these things. So I feel like what my role is as a journalist is to explore these thorny issues and get the experts on who really know. I don't have an opinion on what the best way is to implement all these things. I just know that whatever the system is, it needs to be something that takes into account all these different priorities, which on the surface seem to either compete with or contradict each other, but that I feel using the tools of technology itself, you could probably find smart ways to support both priorities.
It's so interesting. And I feel like, I don't know, this is maybe the jumping off point, if I can sell it to an unchained sort of security versus privacy conversation, because I think it's really the heart of what we're dealing with right now in the space, right? Like post 9/11, this conversation occurred in airports and on city streets. And I think today it occurs on blockchains. And, in the wake of Tornado Cash, we have this conversation, right? Like, how do you enable privacy for lawful users, yet stop North Korea from laundering $1 billion in hacked funds? And I think that's really what good regulation looks like. And to your point, it's hard. Treasury put out a DeFi risk assessment, a month or so ago. I think that tried to start to think about these kinds of issues. Is digital ID a solution? Zero knowledge proofs? Like, what are the tech solutions to some of this stuff? So I think to me, it's like the most interesting question in the space right now. And I love that you're, thinking about it in this way.
Yeah. And, my ancestry is Korean, and actually some of it is North Korean. And so I totally think, obviously the Kim regime is super evil and they're just like imprisoning the whole population in this country, and they're, cutting off their access to information. And I just think what they're doing is terrible. So of course I'm in line with the notion that, they should not have access to this kind of money and, be able to evade sanctions, because, there's, make no mistake about it, when North Korean hackers get control of crypto assets, they are not at all benefiting the North Korean people. That money is not going to everyday North Korean. It is just going to the dictatorship. That's it. It's just cementing power and control over this evil regime. And so, in my estimation, like we should prioritize not allowing North Korea access. And yet, like I said, like as an American, as a private person, I feel we also need to have that priority of privacy. So we need to figure out what the right balance is. And, earlier when I said you could use the technology itself to help prioritize both at the same time, like, some of these different things around like having viewing keys for auditors or for the government, like, I feel like that could be a solution. There's obviously even further considerations about how that gets implemented that I'm sure a lot of people would have a say on, that it's not just like as simple as what I just said. It's like there's a lot of kind of nuances around even something like that. But I do feel that those should be explored. And, people who have a much greater background in all of these things than I do should dive into them and come up with, what they feel is like a really comfortable line. Because, for instance, I think what we saw with Tornado Cash, I probably, would agree with the industry that how the government implemented at least that first sanctions just on the contracts themselves. I'm not sure if that really is. It just felt like kind of a hammer on something that, yeah, needed probably more nuance. But I think you're right. As you said on my show, the government was very alarmed by what happened. And so they just wanted to do something hastily and didn't have the time to kind of come up with that more nuanced solution.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question. And as we move away from this question about how do you regulate sort of the more centralized space, like centralized exchanges, to this much more interesting question in my mind of like, how do you regulate in a truly decentralized world? There's got to be these types of technology solutions, for sure. Staying with sort of policy more broadly for a moment. What have been sort of the most interesting conversations you've had recently, either with guests or sort of in your work on sort of global policy issues, right? Like, obviously, we have this issue in the US right now around who's going to regulate, and it's taking all the oxygen out of the conversation in terms of what thoughtful regulation could look like. But that's not true in the rest of the world. There's some really interesting conversations happening about what a framework could look like. Where are you having or seeing those conversations happen?
Well, this is going to be a little scoop for you because this conversation between you and me is going to come out before the conversation I'm going to
Oh, I
talk
love it.
about. But
Okay.
I literally just wrapped an episode about crypto regulation in Hong Kong. And the reason that I wanted to do an episode on that was because here we've got, these enforcement actions that we're seeing in the US that, I mean, they're maybe not, I guess, sort of what you would expect. Like if you're thinking of regulators going after bad actors, then I don't know if anybody would have put Coinbase on the list to be sued by the SEC. So we have this sort of kind of extreme situation. To me, it's just like a knee-jerk reaction against the actual bad actor, which was FTX. But it doesn't make any sense to me why Coinbase should be punished for FTX. But anyway, point is that against that backdrop, you then are starting to see these other jurisdictions, ones that, at least in my opinion, come from governments that maybe have some antithetical values to what we have here in the US. And so it's interesting to me to see, okay, so not only is it that Hong Kong is implementing these new, it's like a licensing regime for exchanges. And then soon it looks like they're going to be also rolling out regulations for stablecoins. And that apparently is being very quietly sanctioned by the government in China. And Chinese government officials are going to some of these different events. And people are saying that they're sort of calling it a testing ground potentially for, opening up a little bit more of that activity in China. Who knows? But when you complement that activity with what China is doing in terms of its private blockchains and the digital yuan, it does feel like that part of the world is realizing, oh, hey, here's this opportunity. Not only is it the next wave of technology, but it is also it has to do with money, and money is how China has really gained its power. It's used its economic might to throw its weight around the world, even in areas that, have to do with like freedom of speech and you know open information and areas of the world that are not typically censored. And so when you look at how they're doing that and you realize like, okay, they recognize money is important. And they recognize also that the US dollar is the global reserve currency. And they're probably, feeling like, hey, we should have a piece of that pie. And so maybe they're looking at their digital yuan as a way to start to nudge the US dollar from its spot as the global reserve currency. And yeah, so maybe that's why they're kind of starting to open up to different crypto firms. Meanwhile, of course, you also have a lot of activity around that coming out of the Middle East, the UAE. So, generally, it seems like a lot of crypto firms are recognizing like, oh, okay, these other jurisdictions are being much more welcoming to us. And so it does worry me a little bit that, to my mind, the country that has the ideals that are kind of most in line with what the blockchain ethos really is about, is somehow not also the country that is fostering this. It is a little bit mind blowing to me. But, I would say that, hey, like the US has been dominant in the tech, uh, wave, like the internet. It's like Apple, Google, Facebook, Twitter, like Amazon, like literally all the most successful tech companies, they're all American. So, maybe for true decentralization, maybe it's not a bad thing if crypto flourishes across the globe rather than just here. But yeah, as an American, I'm a little bit like, wait, what's
Yeah,
going
no.
on? Doesn't make sense.
I'm with you. Obviously, we work globally, but at the end of the day, I'm an American who's worked in the U.S. federal government for a very long time, and I want this technology here. Um, I think one thing we know is the users are here. So many of the builders are here. To your point about, I actually there's a hearing today, I think, on dollar dominance in the House Financial Services, and I actually testified on a hearing very, very similar to this one about, I don't know, 6 or 8 months ago, where this was discussed. And one of the arguments I made was that Silicon Valley argument you're making, that we have to foster innovation in this next wave of the internet, and how important that is. But it's I mean, and we need to bake in democratic principles, as we build. Really, really interesting moment, though, for sure. The only other place I'd probably add to your list, or maybe a couple other places, is Europe, obviously with Mika, which people have different views on, but everyone loves having some clarity around how to get a license, how you can operate ultimately. The UK has put out some consultations that I think we're very hopeful. So we'll see. But yeah, we still get weeks like this in the US.
Yeah, yeah. And one other note that I would say is we were talking about this on that episode about Hong Kong that I am releasing next week. Hong Kong obviously is good because it has these big financial markets, sort of comparable to like a New York or a London. However, there aren't that many crypto developers over there. And so that's kind of like one thing that, just makes it different. You're right. Like in the US, not only do we have big financial markets, we have a big and vibrant developer community. A lot of the big blockchains have come out in the US. Obviously, Bitcoin, we don't know. Ethereum is kind of a mix of Canadian and a little bit American. But it was largely incubated in Europe, actually. And so Mika, you're right, it's a positive step. And on top of that, there is a vibrant crypto developer community in Europe. So
Right. That's the perfect
potentially.
storm. That's really, really well said.
Exactly.
Interesting. Another argument I made, and I was with some folks at Circle yesterday, as I mentioned earlier, and they'll tell you, look, 98%, I think it is, of fiat-backed stablecoins are in US dollars. And that shows that sort of in this private space, at least, people who are handling or dealing with or trading stable coins globally are essentially trading in US dollars, or at least in an asset backed by US dollars, which is also a really interesting development when you talk about dollar dominance.
Yeah, well, there were a few tweet threads about this. I actually think Sam Bankman-Fried had one of them, but it was either he or somebody. They were talking about how the fact that so many of the stable coins are denominated in U.S. dollars shows that it just shows the primacy of the U.S. dollar and how crypto actually is enforcing that. And something that was fascinating to me when I researched my first book was that even when I was interviewing Europeans or Americans, and I was asking them, about some event, let's say in like 2015 or 2016 or whatever, they would always recount to me the price in dollars, the Bitcoin price or the Ether price in dollars, even if they were, European or Asian or whatever. They were, and many of these people that I was interviewing, they were not Americans. They always, always, always quoted the price to me in dollars.
Yeah.
And that's how they remember these prices. And if anything, so far, at least crypto has enforced the primacy of the dollar. However, what's fascinating is, NFTs is the one area that's not priced in dollars, which is so interesting to me.
Oh, that is really
But
yeah.
that's probably the first thing that's actually been denominated in crypto.
I am going to let you go manage your media empire, Unchained. But before I do, one question. I am a federal prosecutor who's been trying to do a podcast or webcast for the last. I think I'm at about 50 episodes. I'll have to count now that you have 500 under your belt. What are tips that you've learned about doing a great crypto or successful crypto podcast over the last 500 episodes? What does it take? What makes a great episode?
So I know this might sound a little weird, or hopefully it doesn't, but I've come to think of doing a podcast as like writing an article in reverse. So typically for an article, you do all the interviews, and then after that you make the article and then it gets published. But I think of making a podcast as I do all the research and I write this script. And so what I mean is, so for an article, you do all the interviews and then you figure out like the structure and you kind of put it all together, right? But for a podcast, you do all the research and then you come up with the structure. Then you write a bunch of questions that will kind of foster that flow of thought. And then when you go to quote unquote perform the article, which is sort of how I think of it in my head, I generally I know what I want them to say at any given point. I like kind of have a map in my head of all the things that I want to cover. And then I have just written these questions to like elicit that information. Or, if they don't actually give it all, then I'll kind of follow up with a comment or whatever to just get that in there. So anyway, so that's how I do it. And I know it's probably a lot more work than the average person wants to put in, but at least for me, then I know that I've really produced a quality podcast.
Amazing. I'd say just like as someone who's been on and had the experience with you a few times, a couple of things are really interesting to me. One is you're a subject matter expert on whatever we're discussing. And it's because you are about crypto overall, but you lean into whatever that topic is as well. And really, it is a conversation where you're providing your expertise as well. That is something I try to do from a policy or law enforcement, illicit finance perspective. The other thing is this is not scripted, right? Like, I've done plenty of these where you get the questions. You're asking really tough questions, and you're holding your guests to answer them. I remember I think I went on a little too long on the first question on the tornado cash one, and you cut me off and said, "Ari, like, no, this is what I'm asking you." And I was like, "All right," and I fell right into line. But I think that's really that's really important too, for sure.
That is so funny. I don't remember doing that.
Yeah, no, I remember it. Yeah, I think my wife gave me a hard time. She's like, that's why you just needed to answer her question.
Wow. One last thing that I wanted to say about that was that I've had a few guests say things to me like that they're scared of me or things like that. I know everything about everything in crypto. And I'm like, no, I'm like, I cram like crazy. I'm like researching so much before an episode. I don't know everything just naturally. It's like before I, put this mic up to my mouth, I make sure that I know a lot about that topic. But like if you were to just stop me on the street and then ask me about some really obscure part of crypto, of course I'm not going to know it. And so anyway, I just wanted to put that out there because I've had people make these comments and I'm like, don't you know that I come in prepared and that's why? But like, I don't just walk around knowing everything somehow magically.
I think you probably walk around knowing a lot magically, but yes, no, I also think you lean into to every episode. And honestly, the space is lucky to have you. And I think you're just such a critical voice, and bringing in critical voices so regularly. I think it's so important, and congratulations on 500 and good luck on many, many more.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Awesome. No, thanks for coming on, and stay tuned for our next episode of TRM Talks. Laura, thank you so much.